The first library we're going to talk about isn't really a library, and I'm sure a bunch of you already know what this is, and this is JSON. So JSON is a way to communicate data, and the only reason I'm going to explain this is because we're going to use it in the next library. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And what it is it's a standard of serializing data down into a text string, that can be communicated between programs. It can be communicated between different systems, different platforms, and it can be communicated between different programming languages. I can't think of a single website or app or anything that I use today that is completely isolated, that doesn't connect to the internet, that doesn't talk to anything else, that's just completely self-contained. Everything in the future and everything in the future of software is connected in a million different ways to everything around you. And JSON allows software to have a pre-existing, very solid standard of how they're going to communicate data. And like I said, it's cross-language, cross-platform, and importantly, it's a successor to something called XML, or spiritual successor. XML was huge, it was bloated, and if you wanted to send large amounts of data, you were looking at megabytes. Whereas now you can do the same data in, say, hundreds of kilobytes, which does make a difference in load times. And more importantly, XML was, in my opinion, a mess. JSON is graceful, it's simple, and it's to the point. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to a code example, and I'm going to show you just quickly the JSON library in Python. I'm sure this isn't new to some of you, but just in case, we're going to go through it anyway. Just nice and quick. So hopefully this can come up all right on the screen. And we're going to open this one. All right. So in Python, the JSON library is very simply called JSON. You can use it by typing import JSON. And just because a bit of backwards compatibility, everyone in CSS E1001, you're learning Python 3. I use Python 2 because I'm old and backwards. But just so that I can write Python that looks like your Python, I'm importing something called future. And that lets me use print with brackets, whereas in old Python used print without brackets. So don't worry about that. So what I've got here is I've made an object called Elvis. It has a bunch of properties. It's got his name, his profession. And importantly, it's got a mix of types in the property. So I can see his name as a string. I can see his birth year as a number. I've got a Boolean there to whether or not he was married. And I've got an array of strings. And it's important that if I was trying to come up with, from scratch, some sort of way I could transmit that data to a completely different unknown system, I would have to deal with all these data types. I'd have to deal with the fact that Python can have very big numbers and other languages can't. I'd have to deal with how different languages interpret decimals, and it'd just be a mess. JSON allows me to take this and print it out in a standard format. So here's my Python representation, and you can see this looks actually a lot like JSON as is. Python is very big on JSON. It loves it. Looks great already. So I'm going to use a function which is json.dumps, and the S stands for string. So you're going to dump the object to a string, and I'm going to print that out, and I get this lovely string here. And you can see it looks a lot like a Python dictionary where I've got an object which has a key and a value, and I can see over here I've started an array. So it looks a lot like Python. And the beautiful part of that is, say I then send that to a different Python program that I don't know anything about, they can take that string and they can just call json.loads, which loads a string into an object, and voila, I've got the same object there that I had before, even though in theory these are two completely different programs, and I haven't organized with them, I'm going to set up a data standard or whatever. We just use JSON. And JSON is used very heavily for web APIs, which means you can communicate well with websites and get data. You can access websites that give you information about the weather, that give you information about anything you want. And it's all just down to those two functions, loads and dumps. Right. So if you want to know more about the library, you can check out the documentation. The documentation is probably shorter than my slides. There's pretty much, unless you want to do funny things with it, there's loads and dumps. Simple as that. So we're going to use that in a library called requests. So requests is the first real library, I guess. JSON is built into Python. You don't need to install it or anything. Requests is a third-party library, and it allows you to make HTTP requests. It allows you to make requests out to the internet, get data, and use it without having to deal with connections, without having to deal with timeouts, without having to deal with different headers and protocols and stuff like that. If anyone's ever tried to use Python's built-in way to do this kind of thing, it is a disaster. It's a mess, and it's complicated, and it's difficult. Requests is very, very simple, and in their tagline, they want to show you that it's HTTP for humans, because Python's communication libraries read like they were built for robots. So requests is a fantastic library because it, like JSON, simplifies it down to just a couple of functions, and if you really want to, then you can delve in and learn more about how to use it. And you can use this to communicate with software. So if your program is completely isolated and doesn't need any access to the internet, it's probably not going to have a lot of features. In the modern day and age, you need to communicate with other pieces of software, you need to get live information. That's just what people expect, and that's the kind of software everyone here is going to be making when they graduate. Whether or not it's social services like that, it could even be if you're working in industry, communicating with other devices, communicating with authentication systems, everything. Everything now is online. And Request is a very, very powerful library for using that. So let's have a look. This should be familiar to everybody. This is idle. It's meh. So what we're going to do is we're going to import requests. Is that readable? It's a bit small. I'll do another demo in a sec, but what we're going to do is make a request to a website called HTTP bin. You don't need to know what that is. Basically, it's a website that you send a request to, and it tells you about the request you sent. And instead of writing a whole bunch of code to open a connection, to write your URL to it, write your headers, then wait for a response, and then decode that response, we're just going to do request.get and then the URL. And it's going to build a GET request, send it off to the server, wait for the response, get the response back, figure out whether or not it was valid for you, and then just give you the important bit, the data. You don't need to know about anything in between. And I can see that if I, after that, print response.text, I can see that this is what it gave back to me. So it told me about my request, that it's got some arguments and some headers, and it came from UQ. So we'll do another demo that's a bit more real world. So if we go back to here and I open up requests, what I'm doing here is I'm going to import requests, and I'm going to make a request to example.com. Now, example.com is a website. It just says this is an example website. So in theory, in just a few lines, I'm going to import requests, make a GET request, and then print it out. And Python, the Python library should go to the website, get the whole page, give it back to me in 3 lines. So if I run this, hopefully it'll do that. So first line, run, I've imported requests. I'm going to make my GET request, which gave me a response. And then if I print out the response as text, I can see that I've got the HTML for example.com. And I did that in 3 lines. Whereas in the Python built-in, that would be probably closer to 10 or 20, depending on how thoroughly you're actually dealing with all the extra error conditions that you're supposed to deal with. So what if we want to do something more interesting? What if we want to make a request to a website that returns a JSON blob that we just saw? So I could do that GET request, and then I could load it into JSON.loads, and I could get an object out, and I could start manipulating it. And all of that within 2 lines of code. Actually, request has a built-in, which allows you to make a request. So exactly the same, I've got request.get, and I'm making an API request to UQ-Final, which, if anyone doesn't know, is a website you can go in, you can put in your course, and it'll tell you about the assessment and let you calculate your grades. So I'm going to make a request to that, and then I'm going to run this, and it should tell me that my response is a big load of text that looks a lot like JSON. So if I print out that text, I'm going to see a whole bunch of gibberish data, right? And that's a JSON blob right there. So I can easily break into that JSON data by importing JSON like I did before, loading in the course data into JSON, using the .json on the response object, and then I can dump it to a string just to show you the JSON library has an indent function which allows you to print it out nicely, so it's not all this like 1-line gibberish. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to import JSON, turn the response into JSON, and then print it back out, and I should get a lovely list of information about CSSE 1001, telling you the semester and the pieces of assessment you guys are going to be doing. So online problems with a weighting of 10%. Hopefully that looks right. So by just combining those 2 libraries now, I have made in, say, 5 lines, something that can go to an API, it can make a request for data, it can get back that data, it can turn it into a Python object that I can just immediately start programming with. And I've done very little work to get to that stage. And it's this kind of simple power you can add to your programs through libraries that will allow you to take your projects from, say, reading and writing to a CSV or displaying a simple GUI to the user to actually displaying, say, real-time information about the weather or something like that. And it really is a lot simpler than it would look if you're just learning about Python. You'd think, how on earth do I make web requests? How do I understand all this stuff? There's libraries that do it all for you. Cool. So we're going to go back and we'll continue on. You can learn more about requests on the requests doc, and if you've got pip, which comes installed with Python, pip is a package manager, it installs all this stuff for you. You can go and do command line, you can go pip install requests, and bam, you can use it straight away. Just import requests and away you go. And their docs are incredibly user-friendly. They take it very slow at the start, and if you really want to, it gets into incredible detail on every aspect of the request you can modify. All right.